Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are back to our weekly discussions of essays, mostly by Ayn Rand, today by Dr. Leonard Peikoff. This is actually, for those of you who don't know the history of the Ayn Rand Center, this is how we started with weekly discussions of Rand's essays about 4.5 years ago. And the person who will be chairing tonight's discussion is actually the reason why I said we should have such a group, because I was trying to convince him to read Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. And I said, why don't we just start some sort of a discussion group? So here we are 4.5 years later. We're online. We're the Ayn Rand Center UK. We have James Valliant with us to tell us where we are wrong about this, which we didn't have for 4.5 years of discussions without without an authority on the philosophy present. So
maybe where you're right, though.
yeah, that's true. So well, now we'll have a better idea. So yeah, without further ado, Eamon, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So it's good to actually go back to where we started. So this was definitely my favorite part of the event. The essay that we're discussing is Fact and Value by Leonard Peikoff, and it touches on a few different subjects. So the way we usually started this sort of event was to ask people who's read the essay and what kind of questions they have and jump straight into it. I think maybe to warm us up, if James wants to make any remarks about the essay that he has off the top of his head, we can do that. And I can also give a brief introduction to the salient points in the essay. So James, do you have any comments?
Well, just as a matter of introduction,
Yes.
the reason why he wrote the essay at the time was because someone who was a student of Objectivism, a student of Leonard Peikoff's, Dr. David Kelly, had published an essay, Truth and Toleration, about experience he'd gone through. And he made an assertion that Objectivism is inconsistent with normally morally judging people based on the content of their minds. And this, of course, stimulated Leonard Peikoff to write, I think, an essay that is more important than the particular historical reason why he wrote it. It backs up and it discusses moral evaluation of the use of the mind and the relationship not only between values and facts and values, but how that works together to allow us to judge people based on the operation of their own mind. So while it has a particular impetus in the history of the movement, the essay itself has a profound value, I think, as a philosophical expression of Leonard Peikoff's best understanding of moral judgment.
Agreed. So I remember first reading this essay, and it's one of those essays where the central idea, the essence of the idea, is in Rand's writing. So at some point she says, to a living being, every is implies a not, or something like that. And this essay, especially the first half of it, is a massive elaboration on that idea. And it only really was reading this essay that made it fully clear to me what that means, or at least, clearer
Me too.
What that means.
Boy, did I learn something from that essay. Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So, I can kick off questions. If anyone's got any questions, they can raise their hand. So let's discuss the actual central point, which is there is this problem called the Izod Gap. The idea that you cannot derive an ought, ethical prescription from facts, from knowing some scientific sort of observation and then going to some kind of moral, idea, some principle. So this idea, which as far as I know, I've only heard in Objectivism, the idea that an is does imply an ought, but you have to look at it from the in relation to the choice to live. So do you have any thoughts on that, James?
The truth is that it's hard when you come from a religious, and that's the false alternative we're given, either a religious or basically a relativist view of ethics. And that's really what corrupts people from the outset here. To think of values in any other way apart from the way Ayn Rand does, in terms of the good as an objective thing, it's a fact in relation to human life. It's a fact in relation to my life. It's being a relational concept, right? It sort of solves the is-ought problem by saying that the is about the necessity of my life, which are objective, whether it's the physical needs of my life or the broader long-term emotional needs of my life. In either case, what we're talking about here is an objective set of facts, which actually either are good or bad for human life, my life in particular. And that's how Ayn Rand bridges the Izod Gap. Now, for someone who's an intrinsicist, brought up, say, with religious ethics, they think of values as something sort of built into the world, something apart from us, not related to the needs of a human organism. Ayn Rand corrected that, of course. Once you understand that, then, of course, every single fact that you can imagine has an immediate value relation to me. Once you understand the relationship between that is and ought, then suddenly there is no value neutral is. Suddenly every is becomes relevant. Some are more immediately relevant and some are less immediately relevant, but every is now implies an ought. It's not just that, and this is what I had understood before, that every ought is grounded in an is. I got that. There's no ought without a grounding in a biologically rooted teleological is. However, I'm not sure I really grasped the point that every single is, every fact in reality is laden with implications about human life and therefore is of value significance. Nothing is value neutral.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Peikoff formulates that into a principle which he calls cognition demands evaluation. And he actually sort of re-looks at justice as an aspect of that principle. So yeah,
critical one.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely a critical one. That relationship, in order to, whether it's as simple, going outside of his essay, whether it's as simple as the neuroscience of memory, the biologists tell us the way humans remember is because there's salience, people care. If you didn't care, you probably won't remember. You'll only remember if there's some emotional investment. In fact, to think clearly, you really have to evaluate and care. To care, you have to think clearly. So cognition and evaluation must work hand in hand. The one cannot work without the other every single time.
So there's something quite subtle in the essay where he transitions from, every metaphysical fact, so even the fact of gravity implies evaluation. So the knowing the fact of gravity means that it implies that there are certain actions that you need to take. So if you're in midair, have a parachute, I think his example was. But then
when I'm walking along the cliffs by the beach, I really need to attend to the fact of gravity, regard it as an absolute, and let it inform all the evaluative decisions I make while walking along that path.
Yeah. So I think I remember the first time I read this essay, I went around trying to figure out how everything is good or bad. And it's not too difficult. It's like every fact implies, even like the fact that the ground is
he'll give earthquakes and tsunamis. They're not moral agents. They're not evil, but it's a bad thing. All other things being equal, an earthquake or a tsunami is a risk to my life or destructive of human life. You can say bad or good about the tsunami, even though it's not a moral agent.
Yes. And he transitions into the act of morally judging and morally evaluating.
And that's where justice comes in.
Yeah. So this is a question that I find, so I always find it kind of slightly difficult to distinguish between simple evaluation and moral evaluation. So do you want to speak about that?
Well, we just touched on it there. The implications of something to human life or to my life, it present a moral value question, right? And will always present a moral value question in that sense. But to judge a human being, you're judging a volitional agent. And here we introduce the important thing about judging ideas as well, right? Free will boils down to our choice to use our mind to engage in the effort of cognition, to think or not to think, to focus, to increase our focus or not. That is at root. One of the brilliant insights of Ayn Rand is that volition boils down to our choice to think. And if that's the case, as Aristotle understood, it's volition that gives rise to your ability to morally evaluate a moral agent. So while all facts have moral implications, the books on my shelf behind me, each of them have all kinds of value implications to me. Good, bad, evil, influential in a bad way, influential in a good way, very instructive and helpful to me. So all those physical objects there have a moral relationship to me in my life, and I would argue human life. But I can't judge them as good or evil. I can't say the book is. The author might be. The author, all right? And in fact, there's no way to avoid a moral evaluation at some level of the author. Whether I have the information to properly morally evaluate the author of the book is a question of whether I have the context, the facts. But the fact is that each one of those authors used their minds. And that is a question of morality. How did they use their minds? Were they evasive? Were they honest? And therefore, the authors of the books in writing the book can be and should be evaluated when we can. The book itself is just a physical object sitting on my shelf, but it still has value implications one way or another for me. That's really the distinction.
So we have a question in the chat and then a raised hand. So the question in the chat was a while ago, so I'll read it out. So Stephanie asks, is there anything good we can take away from an earthquake or a tsunami? Imagine being primitive and hoping for a small volcanic eruption to get hold of fire again.
Yeah, it depends on the context. It certainly depends on the factual context. If it's a small earthquake and no one got hurt and there was very, very minimal damage, but it opened up a cave that had all manner of resources in there, gold and silver and iron that we could use. That earthquake in that context can be positively morally evaluated. Correct. It does depend upon the full context that we're talking about. That's why earlier on when I said tsunami and earthquake, all other things being equal, even an earthquake, a particular earthquake or a particular tsunami, we might have a different evaluation of depending on the context. So I said all other things being equal. That is to say, under the normal circumstance of facts, tsunamis and earthquakes are bad. But can I imagine a benevolent earthquake, an earthquake that actually led to humans finding real values? Sure.
So we have a raised hand from Antoine. I'll unmute.
Thank you. So I agree there is quite a bit of value in seeing every fact as value laden, in that it insists on the value of judgment, right? If you do recognize that everything can or will have an importance for your life, depending on what you decide to do for it, then it is important for you to keep recognizing that fact and not ignore that the rest of reality will have an impact, and then therefore to stay mentally active and honest. But I don't think any major philosopher or now or before has necessarily argued that when someone has a certain goal, we cannot derive any values from reality given that goal. I don't think Hume, who is one who is most known for attacking this position, has actually argued that if you wish to write, then there is no value in a pencil, right? I'm sure him. I mean, he's a great skeptic, of course. So he might or might not have put this to that as well. But I don't think that the general argument is when you have a goal, do things have value? Because I think that's quite a logical conclusion to draw, and anyone would draw the conclusion. But the more interesting skeptic argument is to say, well, how do you derive that goal, which is giving you all those values, right? So if you want to write, yeah, you need a pencil, but why do you want to write? Well, you want to write because you're working in university and you need to get good grades. Why do you need good grades? And it goes down back and back and back. And at some point, right, according to objectivist ethics, you come down to, well, it's for my life. I need to live, and I want to live. And there are basic things at first that will help me live, and then it's more and more complex the further you go from death. And I think that what we've covered up to now, though, doesn't really answer the question, well, why should you decide to live, right? That question is very much fundamental. And it might seem a bit weird, but I think it has to be answered, right?
You're right in the sense that the whole of ethics really is assumed here. And that if we don't have an objective understanding of values, we're hopeless. We're never going to get off the ground if we don't understand what values are, why organisms have them, why human beings must self-consciously choose and pursue them. Without that understanding, without the wider framework of Ayn Rand's ethics, I think we're hopeless in the entire field of finding objective values or some kind of objective basis for human ethics. Now you ask a very basic question, why choose to live? Which is really at the root of Ayn Rand's thinking here, right? All value choices proceed. There was a discussion just the other day I was having about this. The Peikoff discussion page was saying, well, if all value choices themselves stem from the choice to live, then what values could possibly inform that choice? Why should I choose to live as opposed to die? And we had the discussion as to whether or not this pre-value choice, before we have any real values or can understand values, how could such a choice be made absent those values? Literally, you're choosing nothing over everything. You're choosing, it's not real, in one sense, it's almost not a valid choice, right? You're actually choosing not to choose anything. You're actually choosing non-existence, the eradication of any possible value or anything, in fact. So it's literally the choice between everything or nothing. Of course, a child, when they're first evaluating things, does not address it at that level. It's only as adults that we need to to keep our thinking straight, need to self-consciously be aware of value of life as the only end in itself, the source of values, the whole value pursuit, and the only ultimate end, the only objective ultimate end of our values. Otherwise, we can't keep the hierarchy of our values straight. It's that self-conscious awareness. When we're just infants, every biological function, every physiological mechanism, every autonomic reflex that we have, and surely every experience of pleasure and pain that we have from the time we're born, wordlessly, silently beg us to live. So a toddler, a baby, doesn't need to be told, pursue life. Their whole being is pursuing life sort of automatically. It's only as adults that we self-consciously have to realize my thinking gets screwed up if I put something of value over or apart from life, my life, human life. Once you do that, you've stepped outside of any ability to objectively assess values, correctly put them in their hierarchy, and so forth. Did that answer your question?
It makes it clear, but I don't think it answers the question.
Well, what was the question?
I don't think it answers the question of, well, why everything rather than nothing? I think obviously you made a very clear point that naturally we are pushed to live because our bodies, like the reactions of plants and animals, react to the surroundings, and when the surroundings, because we have been geared to the evolution to survive, because that's the point of the process, that anything which is more or less against survival, so that's pro-death, is going to act negatively on the body, or the body is going to react negatively to it, and we will be pushed away from it. But that doesn't answer the question of why should we not pursue that.
Do
say,
you,
"Oh,
do you
I don't
really
like
find it an arbitrary choice between everything and nothing? Is
Well,
that an arbitrary or a rational choice to choose literally anything and everything over absolutely nothing? That's arbitrary, irrational to you?
Well, if it's not based on values, I'm having trouble understanding how a pre-ethical choice like this can...
A pre-ethical choice that permits any values. So a total valueless existence versus having values strikes you as an arbitrary choice.
Yes.
Well, at that point, I'm honestly going to say that there's no answer to you.
Okay.
If a single sunset isn't worth the enterprise of life, and if you're willing to reject every morsel of tasty food, every enjoyment of human companionship, every beautiful sunset that you've seen, literally all of that, you're saying is worthless compared to zero. I do not see that as arbitrary. I see that as intensely irrational.
Okay.
Irrational, not in a value sense, but just in a perfectly logical sense. You know, I don't need values even at that point, do I? Because what you're literally saying is non-existence is somehow got some temptation for me.
Well, that's the thing. That's where I don't understand, is because I'm not tempted in any way by non-existence. I'm having a great time here, and I enjoy values, etc. I enjoy the sunset, right?
So the value enterprise is a positive thing for you.
So let me point out something in Anton's question that I think reveals a bit of a problem, which is you asked, why should I choose to live? And then you also reformulated another time is on what value basis, or what values do I look at, which
distinction there,
which tells me that I should choose to live. But you also understand that it's a pre-moral question whether you choose to live. So you need some standard of
particular value that can inform it.
Yeah.
All you can do is say all values inform it. The value pursuit itself informs it. Do I want to engage in value pursuit? I mean, that's the choice.
So maybe James, you can. So I'll explicitly say what I thought, which is you can't ask that question, why should I choose to live, without understanding that you're already smuggling in the notion of value and smuggling the notion of morality, because should implies that you have a standard that tells you, but we're trying to figure out what the standard is.
We can't smuggle in any particular value, right?
Yeah.
And we can't smuggle in, right? This value is the decider. What we're not smuggling in, though, is the nature of life. That is to say, it is a conditional form of existence. Only to a living thing, right, can things be good or bad. Only to a living thing is existence a conditional alternative. And it is only that fact that gives rise to value pursuit. Now, I can use the entire, and there, I don't come to the issue of value as the ultimate value, you know, as the end in itself, as the ultimate, life as the ultimate value, except as an adult philosopher. At that point, I do have living under my belt. I do have enormous value experiences. And so what I'm at that point doing is backing up and saying, not should I, is there some value that informs this, but do I want to live? Do I want existence? Do I want all the things that come with any value pursuit? So in a sense, it is a pre-moral evaluation, but it's an evaluation that's already informed. It's like epistemology, right? By the time we do epistemology, we better know a bunch of stuff. By the time we consider the question of life as an end in itself, we've experienced all sorts of values. We have to have, right? And so the question then presents itself as a whole complex. Life or no life, existence or non-existence, value pursuit or non-value pursuit, as such. And that choice is can be rational and non-arbitrary, but it is not, in one sense, an evaluation based on some earlier value. That's all. we speak prose without knowing it for a long time. In other words, we're pursuing life implicitly. Our bodies are, and hopefully in an implicit way, our choices are. But like I say, just to keep our thinking straight. And that's why life as a value has to be the, as the philosophers say, our meta-ethical grounding. Because it's a meta-ethical grounding of all the rest. In other words, I can say that the entire pursuit is value pursuit is irrational to throw away on behalf of nothing, right? Without having to invoke any of my values. But in one sense, I'm invoking all of them at the same time. In other words, the question doesn't make sense unless you've been a value pursuer who implicitly has grounded their values on life. All of good values, since time began, have been grounded in the needs of human life, right? They didn't need, in other words, to come up with a bunch of good values, that grounding. What they needed that grounding for was to keep their values straight so that some things more important than life didn't interfere. But that's understanding where our values came from in the first place. Is it arbitrary or irrational to say, well, no, nothing over everything or anything? No, it's not an irrational choice. It's not an arbitrary choice. It's a choice that's informed by all the value pursuit that I've already done and the understanding that the only alternative is non-existence. So my understanding of life can't be a rationalistic one, an intrinsicistic one, divorced from the experience of life that I've had. I can't get there. When I think of life, it's the concept in Rand's sense, with all of the measurements included and all of the particulars that concept comes with it. So when I have life versus non-existence as the choice, yeah, I can't use, let's see, I love eating lobster. I can't use lobster as my justification for life. Stepping back, I can see lobster serves my life. That's really what it is. It's not that suddenly I become a value pursuer because I've discovered that life is the standard, is it? So value pursuit is a fact of life, just a fact of life, right? I pursue values to survive as an organism. That's simply a fact. So once I understand it at that level, it's literally non-existence versus all value pursuit, any and all value pursuit. That's not an arbitrary choice. It's a rational choice based on experience, in fact, based on a wealth of experience I must have had as a child and value pursuit by the time I get to say Rand's question. So it's important that we don't divorce the question in a rationalistic way and consider life as something, this abstract thing, this process of self-sustaining, self-generated action. Don't use the definition. We don't have the definition when we're experiencing life and pursuing it, right? So in other words, all the pleasure, all the happiness, all the joy, all the breathing and eating and that you've done informs the choice. Nonetheless, it doesn't, it's not some particular from those choices that could possibly inform the choice to live. It's all of them and all at once.
Yeah,
so
I think that
it would be perfectly rational to separate the two, as the question seems to imply.
So yeah, the choice to live as an idea comes up, but is never, as far as I know, is not elaborated on in objectivist literature. I don't know of any place. Maybe if there's a place.
There are some people who've actually, I know Alan Gotthelf and Greg Salmieri have both written extensively on the primordial choice to live. Why is it not arbitrary or irrational to choose life, even though it is a question independent from any particular value judgment?
So yeah, that would definitely be good for us to discuss at some point.
Yeah, I'll try and find the citations for you.
That'd be great. Yeah, I always thought of it as sort of, if you turn up to a medical conference and everyone's discussing how to cure diseases, and you say, but what if I actually like diseases and pain?
Right.
So there's a sort of, I thought of it as simple as there is a entry point into some field, and the entry point to the field of the entry point of the field of morality is the choice to live, because if you choose not to live, everything is thrown away. Yeah,
I had a discussion with a ex-heroin addict on this very topic. Clearly, for a significant part of his life, he was not acting with regard to life as the standard of value, was he? He was playing Russian roulette by using illegal heroin in his arm, which could have killed him, as it tragically kills so many young people. So he was not acting rationally. He was not acting with respect to life as the principal value, was he? When he overcame it, I was able to discuss this issue with him in a very rational way. He had hurt his relationship with his romantic relationship. He'd ruined his job. He found himself in all kinds of insecurity economically. He found himself not able to think and cope at times when he wanted to be able to think and cope. And so in the course of explaining that what he was doing was really selfish, he grasped that. He grasped readily that, oh yeah, it was kicking heroin that was the selfish thing to do. How do you justify that? Well, you have to justify it all the way back down to the grounding in human life. What you were doing is not valuing your life as the ultimate value, sir. I get it, but it wasn't obvious to me. Well, was it obvious to you that you wanted a romantic relationship? Yes. Was it obvious to you that you wanted a successful career, a stable job? Yes. Was it obvious to you that you wanted to be able to think clearly in those times when you weren't able to think clearly? Yes. Well, those things are only values because they contribute to your life, because they permit you to survive. They maximize your chances of living. So understanding self-consciously life as the source of value clarifies our thinking and allows us to avoid the hierarchy problems that, say, the heroin addict was avoiding. But the value of life was always there, always implicit, always the thing behind those other values he wanted: romantic success, a stable job, the ability to think straight. So what we're doing is, all we're doing is stating what's already been going on: the pursuit of life, without knowing it. I don't know if that's helpful. Life is the implicit standard of all objective values. It always has been. People have pursued values objectively without knowing it. So in other words, life is still the operative, ultimate source of values and standard of values, right? There can be no objective values outside of the pursuit of life. It's merely the identification of that which helps keep our thinking straight. But value pursuit is implicitly the pursuit of life, always. Either that or it's not genuine value pursuit. It's a mistaken understanding of values, which necessarily redounds to your harm or death.
So I just realized.
In other words, it's like discovering the principles of concept formation. You've been forming concepts all your life. You've been using unit economy and measurement omission to derive your abstractions, whether you knew it or not. Your valid concepts. The same is true with the life's relation to value. Life is always the grounding for any of your objective values, whether you know it or not. Knowing it helps keep my values straight, my thinking straight, my hierarchy, the priorities between my values straight.
Yeah,
it doesn't change the fact. The fact is the fact. Now you say, why should I choose life? Well, everything you've done, every breath you take, every morsel of food you've eaten has been an egoistic act on your part to stay alive. And that's why you did it. Now, if someone were to say to you, would you choose to starve to death? Would you choose to suffocate? there's an immediate answer to that, right? No, I don't want to suffocate. I don't want to. Ultimately, what they're saying is I want to live, whether they know ultimately that's what they're saying or not. So when you say choose to existence over non-existence, literally everything is informing you to exist. Your biology is informing you to exist. The only alternative, literally, is nothing, non-existence. This is not an arbitrary choice to live. It's not an irrational choice to live. It's the only alternative to literally nothing.
Okay. So we basically went into a discussion of the objectivist ethics.
I'm sorry,
which is.
But if that was the question,
I mean that's what the question demanded. So that's
right.
That's where we went. I was thinking to go back to the essay. There's another major idea that Peikoff introduces in this essay, which is the open-closed system question. But before that, I realized, like, going to there, that's kind of leaving the first half. He still mentions, the kinds of, he elaborates on the kind of stance you should have on people who, as Kelly put it, merely advocate evil ideas, but they don't actually act. So he would. One of Kelly's points was that a Stalin is bad not because his ideas are bad, because his actions were bad. He murdered people. But a Marxist professor shouldn't be morally judged as bad, even though his ideas are bad, because ideas are not for judging in that way. And so this is the idea of tolerance. So I guess we can talk about that idea of tolerance, and then we can finish off with the open-closed system question.
Well, on the face of it, sure, there are honest mistakes. Each of us knows that we've made, in the course of our lives, honest mistakes. Gee, I just didn't know. And I really didn't have any reason to know that that was a particular thing that might upset someone, and I did it anyway. And gee, I'm sorry, I didn't realize your context, and the mistake I made was out of pure ignorance. But back up, all mistakes are an indication of a problem, aren't they? There's something that's gone wrong with my cognition. Every time I make a mistake, every error I make in believing something or thinking something is the result of a problem. And I better be able to diagnose the source of that problem. If it was simply a question of, gee, I didn't know this, right? And really, I had no grounds to know I should have known that. Well, then that isn't, you've provided the context for that moment. When we talk about advocacy, though, ideological advocacy, we're not talking about, gee, I made a mistake because I was ignorant of some particular fact. We're talking about someone who has a responsibility to know what they're saying is true. And when we're talking about academics, when we're talking about scholars, the educated, they have a very high responsibility. If there are facts available that they should know and could know, then their advocacy is morally irresponsible if they don't check those facts out and give them their proper weight and attention. It is dishonest, it is immoral, it is evasive. But coming back down to a basic objectivist point, we think in order to act. Reason is our most basic tool of survival. Thinking is the single most important thing when it comes to life and death. Errors can kill you. Since it's of that magnitude of importance, those who advocate ideas are responsible for the consequences, the real world consequences. In a sense, they're more responsible for the real world consequences than people who simply take what they said on authority. Of course, you don't take things on authority. They had a responsibility too. But the more a person knows or should have known, and the more they get out there and advocate and get people to go along with this bad idea, the more they are morally responsible for the consequences, for the real world consequences of that error. It's no excuse to say, well, gee, I didn't know. They should have known if they're advocating. To advocate is to sort of put yourself on the hook for an enormous responsibility of thought, consideration, finding out all the relevant information there that is out there to know. So after Stalin, after Mao, for an academic communist to say, yeah, I'm pretty much an unreformed communist, I'm a Marxist. How about Marx himself? Even before the negative experiences with Marxism, Marx was engaged in mental dishonesty as far as I'm concerned. Polylogism. And if polylogism is right, then of course his thinking is just bourgeois logic. So Marx was a mystic. Marx was irresponsible in the way he used his mind. He was a rotten economist, a poor historian, a lousy political thinker, but those emanated, in my view, from his dishonesty, from his mystical approach to knowledge. And therefore, I can morally judge Marx, and do. He was an irresponsible thinker, a brilliant man who was irresponsible about the way he used his mind. That's why he made such systematic errors. And systematic errors, when we're talking about systematic errors, and systematic errors from people who develop and advocate ideas, then we are usually talking about a moral issue here, a misuse of the mind at the very least. There's something wrong when someone makes a big mistake like that, and very often it's a moral breach, an evasion. Morality begins with the choice to think, the responsibility to think. And if you are, if this is important to you, or if you're advocating this, then you have a particular moral obligation to think it through and to gather all the available relevant information. To the extent that you're not, you are acting immorally. The bad ideas and their bad consequences are traceable to you.
So there's this really, I think, for me, illuminating example that Peikoff gives of the employee and the employer, and the idea that if an employee, an employee that comes with a good idea to the boss, and you know, some sort of innovation, and then the boss recognizes that and says, not only do they say this thing is true. So the Peikoff wants to stress that you not only will recognize that this thing is true, but you'll be happy and morally, you know, you'd want to praise that employee, because you'll realize all the implications of that good idea and the effort that it took to come up with that idea. And the flip side of that is, if you have and I love this actually, this example, it's like if you have an employee that just comes up with a really stupid idea that flies in the face of the facts, that just absolutely, you know, would be disastrous if employed, not only do you think false, this is wrong, as in this is just, you know, inaccurate, you also, and this is, I think, definitely true for me, so you also think to some degree bad. This is bad. This is like, this lowers my opinion of this person, because if this person is a source of falsehoods, of ideas that if they were put into practice would be disastrous. Now this is like a very small example. This is an example of
one. And we may not know whether it's a epistemological issue, a psychoepistemological issue. What is it? A question of ignorance. But if a guy comes up with a bad idea, it's got to lower your opinion of him. Maybe he doesn't know. But if he should know, and he's your employee, then you have to be able to evaluate the person behind the idea as well. And this is of crucial importance in many, many, many areas. Every employer, every colleague that you work with, everyone you would engage in, business. Would you engage in regular business with someone you knew had very poor judgment and wasn't using their mind properly or responsibly for whatever reason? If it's important enough that we figure out that reason.
When you think of the Marxist professor or someone who's, in the light of that example, it's even clearer why you couldn't just think, oh, this guy has just, different ideas. We just simply disagree.
Right. He is in fact not only unqualified to be teaching something like political science or political philosophy, but he is not thinking properly. I wouldn't trust his judgment. I have to be aware of that. I wouldn't trust him as a human, and I wouldn't trust his judgment as such. Absolutely.
What do you say to people who are uneasy about this question of rejecting tolerance, so as a virtue?
Well, there is an area where we have to be, where it kind of makes sense, but not in the sense that David Kelly means. It's not that we're suspending judgment because, gee, it's just a disagreement about what we believe or how he uses his mind, right? It's not that, but we have to sometimes recognize that we do not know the context. We do not know why the error occurred. Those are specific kinds of contexts, right? And we have to recognize those. There are many times when a person is learning and coming through a process of honestly trying to work through their mistakes, for example, and they could make all kinds of mental errors along the path. Gosh knows I have, make all kinds of errors along the path towards discovery. And in those cases, I think it behooves us to be extremely patient and tolerant. There is such a concept here where when you're taking yourself or someone else from a state of ignorance and really bad mistakes, you know, we all start out as kids. We all rely, and to a certain extent, on the authority of our parents. Now, there comes a point where, you know, as we mature, we begin to question things, question our parents, and it is a moral issue, the degree to which we're responsible in not doing that, or passive in simply accepting what our parents and our culture give us. That's a moral issue too. But if there is such a thing as a person who is sincere, trying to find the answer, being as honest as they can be, and just groping, just making innocent mistakes along the way. Now, in that case, however, those folks, generally speaking, don't advocate their mistakes along the way. They're sort of grope, is this true? This is what I think at the moment. And they're not going to be advocates for it, pushing it on other people, demanding it to be public policy. Right? That matters too, doesn't it? So while there are contexts in which our ignorance of someone's state, you know, what do they know? Are they honestly groping towards the truth? Or are they just evading and now teaching the world the product of their mental dishonesty? So I would say that we haven't eliminated, and it is an important concept to bear in mind. And it is important to be patient with people who are groping honestly and making mistakes, and being tolerant even of those mistakes as they're making, so long as they are engaged in a moral and honest process, a responsible process of using the effort to think or not. So we haven't eliminated the concept of saying, hey, you know, you've made a mistake, but that was an innocent mistake at all. And nor have we eliminated the concept of, gee, I just don't know that other person's context well enough to say. There are circumstances like that. But there are also lots and lots of circumstances where we can say, no, because of that person's context and what they're doing and saying about their ideas, they're dishonest, they're immoral, and they're destructive of human life.
Louise in the chat says, rejecting tolerance does, and this is answering my question, rejecting tolerance does not mean that we punch people in the face. When someone presents an evil idea, we can still respect people's rights while scorning, condemning, or criticizing their ideas. And Bob also answers my question by saying there is political tolerance versus moral tolerance.
Yes, I sort of just assumed that. Obviously, a disagreement of opinion, even if it is rooted in immorality, doesn't give me a right to punch anyone in the nose or even prevent them from publishing their opinion. No, of course not. People still have rights. The mistaken have rights, right? Precisely because humans have free will, precisely because it's an individual thing. So, yeah, force is still suicidal on my part if I'm using merely against someone who I disagree with. No, only the initiation of physical force can morally justify my use or the government's use of physical force. So no matter how wrong, even if it's rooted in clear immorality, they still have rights. So long as they're not coercing anybody else, they shouldn't be coerced. In fact, giving them a microphone to spout their evil nonsense is probably our best bet. Let the world know just how stupid they are, and let us respond, and the truth will benefit. So this isn't a question of whether I punch them in the nose or not, violate their rights or respect their rights or not. A person has that absolute right to be totally ignorant, even if it's grounded in dishonesty, so long as they're not coercing other people.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, the important point, and I think it wasn't Louise, it was Louis, I guess, Louis. So I got that name wrong. The point that Kelly makes, using the word tolerance, which is, I would say, in the political sense, is laudable thing. You want people not to go around punching people they disagree with, but he means, and he makes it clear in his essay, what he means is that he disapproves of people morally condemning and criticizing people, and their character for their ideas that they espouse, and calling someone evil for holding, evil ideas would be hysterical and over the top. So I think he kind of hides behind the word tolerance there.
Yeah, obviously the validity of tolerance depends on what we mean by tolerance. I don't tolerate ignorance, error, and dishonesty in one sense, right? I will call it out. I will disassociate from people I know to be dishonest. In that sense, I'm intolerant. It will affect my behavior, whether I interact with the person and how I interact with that person if I have to. So in that sense, I'm not tolerant. I'm going to judge them insofar as I can, and using all the facts I can. And I will actively morally evaluate that, because it is important to me to know whether or not I'm dealing with someone who's honest, irrational, etc. For my sake, I need to know. I need to actively judge every single time I have the facts to judge. So obviously it depends what you mean by tolerance. No, I'm intolerant of the dishonest. I'm intolerant of the irrational. That affects my voluntary choices, right? I'm politically tolerant, if that's that's sort of John Locke sort of used toleration, right? If I'm politically tolerant, then all I'm doing is saying I'm not going to initiate force against someone until they start coercing me or others. That's two different senses altogether of the word tolerant. But no, I'm not tolerant of the dishonest and the irrational in my judgment sense, or in how that affects my personal behavior. Because remember, there's an active component to every moral evaluation, right? I'm not just evaluating them to feel superior, or to get others to make them think bad, to get other people to think badly of them. No, I'm evaluating this person because I have to make important decisions with respect to my life and well-being.
So unless there's any questions about the tolerance as a virtue question, I think the final point that Peikoff makes in the essay is the distinction between the open and closed objectivism, sort of idea. So I think we can, move on to that question. So what is this? What is open and closed objectivism? Why is it? Why did Peikoff feel the need to identify that and to explain it to people?
Well, Ayn Rand had a very clear idea of her philosophy, and she is, she's not like one of these philosophical thinkers that had an insight or a couple of insights here and there. One could think of a philosopher, I don't know, like John Locke, lots of errors. He was a Christian. He believed in the veil of perception. He had the representational, causal view of perception that completely, with these secondary and primary distinctions and stuff. His empiricism was poorly grounded. He had all these Christian mistakes in his head, right? But was his notion of rights a revolution in philosophical thinking? Yes. It was predicated, in my view and Rand's view, on Aristotelian thinking, natural law thinking. That's true. But I can't say that Locke's systematic philosophy is, what I would live by. He had a great insight. Now, that insight inspired all kinds of other thinking. It inspired the thinking of, the Enlightenment, the liberal Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, and further on, the neoliberal philosophers like John Stuart Mill. Without John Locke, we couldn't have the development of, as insofar as we had it, from Jefferson to Mill to Herbert Spencer, who gave us at least some value in political thinking. But that's the spectrum it's along, political thinking. So yeah, there's all kinds of developments from this great insight that John Locke had, but it's not a systematic philosophy. Ayn Rand had a systematic philosophy, a method, a metaphysics, and a whole fundamental approach to ethics as such, as well as an entire set of normative ethics. She applied these ethical insights to both politics and aesthetics in a revolutionary way. She has an entire system of thought. If one is going to say, I'm an objectivist, you can't just develop Ayn Rand's ideas like you could say, develop the notion of rights from Locke. You can't just be Jefferson or John Stuart Mill or Herbert Spencer developing the ideas of John Locke. Doesn't work that way with objectivism. Objectivism is a system. And in that sense, either you could agree with Ayn Rand about point 1, point 2, but not about point 3. That doesn't make you an objectivist at all. Everyone knows that. David Kelly would not say I'm an objectivist just because I believe in the free market. No, to be an objectivist is to believe a system of thought. People like Kelly and others want to alter that system, want to put in their own 2 cents and develop it, augment it. So let's see, Locke's harm principle is, is somehow developed further, injuring one another in Jefferson, developed a little further in Locke, developed a little further in Spencer, so that we can say that this notion of individual rights that Locke started developing was sort of all developed in this wider movement. That's not the way objectivism is, right? It's a movement. It's that's to say a system of thought. You cannot modify any principle of objectivism without exiting objectivism. Any modification of any of those principles, since Ayn Rand had an integrated system, all worked out and thoroughly integrated within itself, is to step outside of objectivism. So if I were to say, yeah, I'm an objectivist, except I disagree with romantic realism because I don't think people have free will. Well, I'm not an objectivist. Plain and simple, you've exited the world of objectivism. To the extent that anyone like David Kelly says, well, we can tamper with the philosophical principles at the margins. Now, the response that normally comes is, well, you're saying that philosophy's done? There's nothing more to learn in philosophy then? No, there'll be all kinds of things that humans, all kinds of questions in the field of philosophy that people will answer and develop and elaborate on. And it could even be an elaboration on objectivism, but it won't be objectivism. Objectivism are the principles, the philosophical principles that Ayn Rand herself developed and understood in her lifetime. And any attempt to alter any of those principles, modify any of those principles, must be rejected just for the sake of the integrity of objectivism. We have had more than that. There was a history in objectivism. I've discussed this before. There were all manner of students of Ayn Rand who were going in weird and funky directions. Take Murray Rothbard. He became an anarchist. He was a student of Ludwig von Mises, read Atlas Shrugged, was impressed with the Aristotelianism, with Ayn Rand's argument for natural rights. In his books, he adopted natural rights thinking, very alien to an Austrian economist. He got it straight from Ayn Rand. Of course, he never cited her and gave her proper credit for all that he was stealing from Ayn Rand. But it was a rationalistic sort of presentation of some of Rand's ideas. Well, what does he do? He ends up an anarchist. That's not objectivism. You can't say, okay, well, since Murray Rothbard is an Aristotelian who believes in natural rights, therefore he's an objectivist. No, he rejected objectivism when he rejected the need for a government as the monopoly, the legitimate monopoly of force, didn't he? I would tell that to Dr. Kelly too. If what you're doing is changing Ayn Rand's view of charity, or if what you're doing is changing Ayn Rand's view of moral judgment, right here, that people can and can't be morally judged based on their ideas, which Ayn Rand did and articulated as an idea and had the philosophical grounding for it. Free will is rooted in our thinking or evasion. Therefore, I can evaluate people based on their ideas, and I'm going to evaluate Kant, and I'm going to evaluate Marx, and I'm going to evaluate the behaviorists like Skinner. Ayn Rand evaluated people based on their thinking. So Kelly is there rejecting Ayn Rand's idea that you can evaluate people based on how they use their mind. That has kicked him out of objectivism. Any such modification to objectivism is no longer objectivism. And he should have the good grace to say, well, that while I agree with some of what Ayn Rand said, I disagree with one of her fundamental points about free will and the use of the mind and how we can morally judge people based on how they use their minds.
Yeah, I always thought, why was it so hard for them to just say that? Which is, I agree with some things, but I disagree with other things.
Right.
Which is, in the early days, one of the reasons why I wasn't drawn to them, because basically, if you wanted, if you're someone who's interested in someone's ideas, you want to go to someone who's very clear about, this is what I think she thought, and this is the scholar, this is some scholarly work around trying to uncover her ideas, and this is what I think, and I'm going to keep those things separate so that it's clear when someone comes to what I write, that I'm not trying to pretend that I'm expanding. I'm not it's like, this is probably not a very good example, but I really like Harry Potter, say, and I'm like, well, I want to join this Harry Potter bandwagon. I'm going to write the 7th book. I actually don't know how many books there are, but I'm going to write the 8th book, and it's in the canon of Harry Potter because why can't we all add to this Harry Potter stuff? And I actually, in fact, I would say that it is, this is the official Harry Potter. It's like, why are you doing this?
Why?
Just keep things separate.
Only Miss Rowling can give us an official Harry Potter book.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's it. That's it. It's like, and when people, people have written, stories in the more detective stories in the further adventures of Sherlock Holmes, but you have to and they're very keen to distinguish. That's not Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. This is my Sherlock Holmes, or Hollywood's Sherlock Holmes, in a new story, in a really creative, different story. And no one pretends that that's an original Conan Doyle story, right? And that's it. Kelly wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants his modifications of objectivism, his modifications of moral evaluation, say, based on the use of one's mind, to be part of objectivism, that one can be both him and Peikoff and still both be objectivists. Leonard Peikoff, when he writes, say, the dim hypothesis, is very keen to say, this is me. A bunch of this stuff I did not ask Ayn Rand about. I don't know what Ayn Rand would have said about some of this stuff. So this book here is me, Dr. Leonard Peikoff. This is not objectivism. Now, has he contributed more to philosophy? Yes. But he had the honesty to say, look, some of the fundamentals here are all me.
So yeah, I'm actually fascinated by the psychology of people like that, but I think that takes us off the essay.
It is a fascinating psychological. Why are they trying to glom on? Why do they need that? It's sort of like stealing the moral value from someone that you disagree with, which is yucky and dishonest, I think. Yeah.
So there are some comments which I think in the chat, which I think are worth sort of just elaborating really quickly. So it kind of it pertains to this idea of, once you have objectivism, does that mean the job is done? And you said no already, but maybe speak about the fact that how do you see objectivism situated? So the fact that if you're someone comes from the perspective that it's a closed system, it's basically the works of Ayn Rand and anything she approved. How is that situated in the work in philosophy in general? It's not all of philosophy, right? There's other things to
Certainly
do. There's
not.
other questions.
Right.
So
just as we can identify Aristotelianism and Platonism and Thomism, just as we can identify Enlightenment rationalism versus Enlightenment empiricism, just as we can identify, romantic philosophers, right, from logical positivists in the 19th century. So there is a distinct set of ideas, objectivism. And there are intellectuals who are doing all kinds of work in philosophy and psychology and history, but we were working within the objectivist tradition, but we're not adding or subtracting to objectivism. In my work, for example, Creating Christ, I couldn't have done it without Ayn Rand. I freely acknowledge, and have done so many times, without Ayn Rand's moral insight, I couldn't have seen what I did about the particulars and the historical origins of Christianity. Is my work objectivism? No. If I turn out to be wrong about Creating Christ, does that implicate objectivism at all? No. However, my work is within the tradition of objectivism. It's, I think, creative work, it's original work, it's new work, but the inductive process by which I came to my thinking was fully informed by my studies of Ayn Rand's philosophy, my studies with Leonard Peikoff, and I epistemologically couldn't have gotten there without that help. But ethically speaking, if Ayn Rand hadn't cleared the decks and provided an objective basis for values, and an egoistic one, and if Ayn Rand hadn't gone so far to criticize altruism as a real world power grab, a collection of sacrifices, again, I don't think I could have understood the morality of Christianity to understand its relation to its historical context in the first century. So there's all kinds of insights that Ayn Rand has blessed us with. There are literally thousands of such applications waiting to happen. Ayn Rand has opened up the possibilities now, as far as I can see, an unlimited number of possibilities in various areas. Methodologically, ethically, politically, aesthetically, psychologically. And all those achievements will be within the objectivist tradition if they're consistent with it. They will be the manifestations of objectivism, if you will, right? Even certain additions to philosophy, I could say, will be consistent with part of the wider tradition of, but they're still not objectivism. They're applications of objectivism, and at best, true implications of objectivism that we confirmed later. But they won't be objectivism. When Ayn Rand died in 1982, that closed the book on anything new entering objectivism.
I think one of those questions was a solution to the problem of induction, which I still haven't actually read all the all the sort of attempts at explaining that within the objectivist sort of sphere. So I would love to actually talk about that at some point.
Oh yeah, that's a great topic.
One of my favorites. Yeah, I would love that. See, there's a YouTube question which I think can be answered very quickly, which is, can you cite where Rand stated or implied all facts imply values? I think it was in Objectivist Ethics.
I think she does. And at the time, I remember it as, asking sort of Leonard this, because I was in the living room when he was doing that. We were there. My own personal experience, perhaps I should have indicated earlier, but I was part of a seminar in Dr. Peikoff's home every Saturday night, where we were reading Objectivism and Philosophy of Ayn Rand before it was published, chapter by chapter, giving him manuscript feedback on it. Well, one of the Saturdays, he set aside the chapter we were supposed to discuss that night. I was all ready to discuss that chapter. He set it aside, said, today we're going to do fact and value. And he read very emotionally and passionately fact and value. And when it was all done, he asked if we had questions. I raised my hand. I said, yeah, I don't get that. I don't understand that every fact is value laden. I understand that every value is fact-based, but I don't get that every fact is value laden. Well, he didn't cite me to Ayn Rand, to anything in Ayn Rand other really than her novels, to the way she presents everything in the novels, as well as her own moral evaluations of stuff and people. of stuff and people. But it is implicit, isn't it?
So I think it's even stated, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's stated explicitly in the Objectivist Ethics, where she says, to a living organism, every is implies an ought.
Right.
Where is the fact and ought is
right.
the value.
Every is implies an ought. But there's a way of, yeah, and that does answer the question, actually. But the way I understood that before is every is implies an ought to something, not necessarily to me. You see? I was kind of being rationalistic there, wasn't I? Right? And I think, oh, sure, every is an ought to something or some organism, some human out there. Well, why me? Why me? And so she actually did say it there clearly. It's just I didn't get it. And because that the statement by itself, to me, was ambiguous when it really shouldn't have been.
Yeah, I as I said, I didn't get it at all until I saw it in this essay. Because it needs to be elaborated, these ideas. Just because someone states a fact, you're not going to understand it unless you're...
There's a whole lot more that can be written about when it comes to moral judgment and evaluation. There are, both philosophical and psychological issues to take into account here. I think someone could write a whole book on moral evaluation. It's that complex and that important a topic.
I think we have come to cover pretty much all of the essay, so we can have a free range sort of question period. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, please raise your hand or put it in the chat. There's one YouTube question which I can ask, which is going back to sort of ethics in general, which is, can you speak on hierarchy of values and how one goes about establishing it? This is sort of changing gears quite a lot, but maybe you have some words.
Well, I think we all have a sort of, in the course of our development, have a seat of the pants hierarchy of development that occurs in our childhood. This is more important than that. That's more important than this. But what we're doing along the way is just comparing one to the other without an explicit understanding of what really is the basis for structuring my hierarchy. What are really the priorities within my values? And there, of course, it is life that has to be understood self-consciously as the only end in itself, the ultimate value. Without that grasp, we are always in danger of reversing some priority, getting some priority wrong. And of course, there's all kinds of bad philosophy that's actively getting us to disassociate, disconnect. You have Christians who are, working to get into heaven and getting their whole community to get into heaven. So for centuries, Christians would burn people at the stakes out of Christian love, because they were heretics. I mean, what is the importance of a few hours of pain here on earth compared to their immortal soul? So if you really love someone, you'll burn them at the stake, and torture them and so forth. So, wow. Talk about getting priorities way out of whack, right? And that is the direct result of putting your values in some supernatural dimension, some eternal life. You've destroyed the connection between life and value, haven't you? You've now obscured the relationship between life and value so that now you can actually do things that are promoting death. You can become an implicit death worshiper if you don't understand where values come from, what generates value pursuit, as Ayn Rand did. Take a simple act, a real genuine question of morality. Is it okay to lie? When is it okay to lie? It's wrong for me to fake reality in the pursuit of values, right? But if the Nazis come knocking on the door and you're hiding Jews in the basement, you're not going to say second door on the left. You say, Jews? I don't know any Jews. What the hell are you talking about? So when is it okay to lie? The only way I can assess that kind of thing is by understanding the priority of my values and why honesty was a value in the first place. Honesty itself has a specific context. Without understanding that context in relation to all my other values, ultimately in relation to the value of life, I'm not going to be able to make that assessment of priorities correctly. Although, like I say, through most of our life, we're doing seat of the pants. You take someone like Immanuel Kant, and his deontological ethics, he has on purpose gone right to the root and severed any connection between life and values, between consequences. Deontological ethics. Consequences don't matter, right? It's a question whether we can come up with a universalizable principle or something. Wow. So he is, by severing at root any possibility of the connection between life and value, he has systematically put himself in a state of cosmic ignorance where he cannot prioritize values at all.
So yeah, I think the question of the value hierarchy, I think you can approach it from two perspectives. One, just simply observing the fact that you do care about certain things more than others. So thinking of it as I'm just observing and trying to figure out that there is this structure and just discovering things. And then if you start off there, you could figure out, as you said, if there's any inversion of priorities. And that's you know.
Ethics is a science.
Yeah.
Ethics is a science. And by that, I mean it in the literal sense. We have empirically generated truths, right? Now, inductively generalized truths, right, that we accumulate. And we realize, though, that all of those value truths, evaluation truths, are themselves in a systematic relation to each other. Ultimately, and this is one of the great discoveries of Ayn Rand, ultimately, life is the source of all of them. Life sets the agenda for the priorities. Without that understanding, and we're still at the dawn, Ayn Rand has just invented the science, if you will, and we're still at the dawn of that science.
So there's a question for you, James, pertaining to some of your previous work. And this is from the YouTube. Alejandro says, James, based on your study of the ancient world, do you think that the relation between facts and values was better in ancient Greece and Rome?
There's really two answers to that. One is it was better, but it was because they were unaware of what they were doing. They sort of assumed a relationship between fact and value. They very frequently didn't have this dichotomy between fact and value. Right. Also, there was an implicit egoism, right? Both Plato and Aristotle had a sort of Aristotle much more, but even Plato, there's an implicit egoism in most Greek thinking, whether it's Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, they assume that what you're doing is after the best for yourself. They assume that what you're doing is trying to pursue your life and make it the best life for yourself you can. Even the Stoics, some of the Stoics were like that. So in one sense, there wasn't this dichotomy that I think Christianity and modern philosophy, even worse, sort of drove a wedge between theory and practice. And you could understand religion does that, right? Religion drives a wedge between the real and the ideal, between the values on earth and value pursuit in some non-existent supernatural dimension. If perfection can't be achieved on earth, where the hell are we getting this idea of perfection? Well, there's this Platonic world of forms. There's this Christian kingdom of heaven. And so the world always gets dissed and diminished the minute you postulate a supernatural dimension, right? And the more consistent that develops, the further down that line you get, the more you sever life and values until you have priests and nuns in the Middle Ages, vows of celibacy, vows of poverty, whipping themselves bloody on the back, drinking laundry water, as their only, the self-mortification, literally, they were at war with their bodies. Literally at war with their bodies because they separated life on earth as the source of moral values. The minute that project got underway, right, the corruption, in my view, happened. But when you go back to the most ancient Greeks, they sort of assumed an implicit egoism, which was a lot healthier in my mind than the sort of extreme altruism that Christianity represented based on Neoplatonic thought, but using this anti-earth Neoplatonic dualism, Christianity systematically set out an extreme form of self-sacrifice here on earth. And frankly, the only way you can imagine that even getting off the ground is by someone developing some world of forms, some supernatural dimension where things can be perfect, where the theory works, just not in practice here on Earth. Ultimately, a war with your very body, both in the Eastern and Western mystical traditions. Once that level of mysticism gets developed, now we're talking about moral values that are actually pro-death, anti-life moral values. And then you get to a philosopher like Immanuel Kant. He doesn't have the innocence of Plato, who's trying to figure these things out. He's actually trying to justify the Christian worldview. The separation of earthly values from morals.
Yeah, so I think this kind of goes back to the idea of the choice to live and how it's such a natural choice that pretty much every human being makes it. The fact is, we have a choice to make, while animals don't make that choice. They just automatically pursue life. And it's fascinating to me, actually, to sort of dwell on that for a little bit, because imagine that systematically every human didn't choose to live, then you wouldn't have humans anymore. And right. The question of how bad a philosophy or culture is to what extent do they adhere to this choice to live? So they
absolutely correct. Ayn Rand's analogy is really beautiful there, isn't it? If you saw a bird, a mother bird, destroying its baby's wings, you'd think how utterly perverse. And yet that is what philosophy, in effect, is doing to our young, right? We can act as our own destroyers precisely because our ideas can become detached from reality. We can think abstractly. And this ability to think abstractly permits us to go off and make huge mistakes, so that a self-conscious application of reason, the self-conscious application of life as the source and ultimate judge standard of our values are absolutely critical. Without those self-conscious awarenesses, our minds can veer off and have veered off into the irrational, the evasive, the anti-life, the destructive.
So this is, again, sort of maybe a slightly off-topic question, but it always fascinated me, this idea of, and actually it's to do with I guess, talking about ancient peoples and their sometimes more primitive people having better philosophy because they haven't had a chance to develop a bad one.
Right, they just assumed, for example, the value of life.
Yeah.
Of course, to them, the choice to live or not was not even didn't even come. Why would you even, how would that possibly, what, do you want to die right away? You're just going to kill yourself? It would seem madness to them.
Yeah, so really evil ideas have to be, so it's no, I think it's kind of not a coincidence that Kant, and I don't understand Kant fully, but that it would end up being someone like Kant that Rand regarded as the most evil person in history, because you have to really, if something was very brutally evil and obviously evil and anti-life, like just go and kill yourself. So if it was that obvious and people followed it, it wouldn't last. Just like a virus that is too deadly doesn't spread very quickly. You need to have a slightly dormant virus for it to spread and for it to infect a lot of people and for it to cause maximal harm.
You got to sell Kant as an Enlightenment thinker. You got to sell Kant as some people do, an individualist political thinker. You've got to sell Kant as a paragon of reason, when what he's done is destroyed reason. That's what that is the camel's nose under the tent, isn't it? Because systematically he's attacking reason. Systematically he's saying that, in other words, all mysticism begins with the attack on reason. It must, right? There's something that reason can't know. There's something your reason doesn't know. Your reason can't reach this higher knowledge. Those are all the various forms. Kant really just gave elaborate explanation for how reason can't really get it things in themselves. The noumenal world, except for some occasional voice of duty booming in on ethics, it's inaccessible to us. And in the realm of ethics, it's not about this world. It's not about any consequences in this world. You have duties, because that's the only morally significant thing, are these duties that this booming voice from the noumenal world is giving us. So in effect, he was justifying, by implication, this Christian worldview that separates fact and value systematically and at the root. But he sold it on the Western world because he's, a paragon of philosophical reason, an Enlightenment thinker.
Yeah, I wonder how this is one of the reasons why it's actually quite difficult to argue against the very effective bad ideas, because they don't they're always packaged up in a certain way.
There's something I wanted to add. I can even understand someone having a hard time grasping that, let's say, Kant was the single most evil man in history. I can accept, in other words, you don't have to believe that and still believe this fact and value truth. It could be a question of your understanding of Kant, right? And the effect of ethics. Ayn Rand, as Leonard Peikoff says, had this extraordinary ability to see the real world concrete consequences of an abstract idea. So that if someone told her some idea of Plato or Kant or Hegel, she would immediately react. No matter the most abstract idea, she'd immediately react because she could see, oh, you're threatening my husband, you're threatening my work, you're threatening everything that's beautiful in New York skyline. All of her values were suddenly on the line with this abstract idea. And that ability is simply the understanding that there's no difference between fact and value. Every abstract idea will have such implications. Some people need to grasp that idea to even understand why Kant could be the most immoral man in history. But being Kant, he understood that philosophy had consequences. He was doing it precisely so he could justify, and he says so that he could justify, in effect, the Christian worldview. That's dishonest, that's immoral, and he knows it's going to have consequences. So, but to reach that state, reach the state where you know that this guy knows or should have known that he was being systematically dishonest, is itself a context of knowledge you have to generate. So I don't judge someone if they say, well, I don't get the idea that Kant could be the most evil guy who ever lived. I understand. That is really a very complex conclusion to reach from philosophy. On the other hand, once you understand that morality begins with volition, volition is how we use our minds. People who set out to be philosophers and know the importance of philosophy have a particular responsibility, and so forth.
So another question from Alejandro, I think following up from the last, isn't the idea that values as the means to save civilization from our, quote, evil nature, the ultimate development of the detachment between facts and values? Do you want me to repeat that question? Because I don't think I got it.
I think I get it. I think what he's saying is true.
Okay.
Insofar as I
understand
the question. Yeah, truly. I mean, think of it. Just the whole idea of a theory-practice dichotomy. Just the whole idea of something being good in theory but not in practice. Or we can't really be perfect. There's no perfect circle and there's no perfect morality in this world because values belong to this pristine, world of ideas out there, both a Platonic and a Christian idea. You've severed fact and value there, at least on earth, haven't you? By the time you get to Kant, you severed fact and value as such, as concepts. So yeah, it is this willingness to live with this hypocrisy. Men are inherently corrupt. Human beings are in desperate need of salvation. That's the premise of Christianity. We can't really know. We're ignorant. We're corrupt. We're rotten, basically rotten. Left to our own devices, we would hurt each other. if there's some inherent evil to humanity, if we have original sin and so forth, right? You've already destroyed individual volition as the source of morality. You've smuggled in ideas with unearthly demands, separated fact and value at its root.
Yeah, I think I do understand the question. So if you don't regard that to be a connection between fact and value, that's going to lead you to compartmentalize, to sort of think in this world there's these ideas, and this is separate from this other world.
It could lead you to theocracy, burning people at the stake, self-immolation, the mortification of the flesh. Once you've separated facts on earth from your values, from your real values, your highest values, then you could end up being a self-destructive masochist, a slow, drawn-out masochist who's engaged in suicide on the installment plan, or murder or mass murder on the installment plan. The dangers of separating the ultimate value of life from our moral evaluations, consequences from moral values. What Christianity and Kant do, in effect, is life and death. It's life and death. It's the Spanish Inquisition. It's Hitler. It's Stalin versus, freedom and science and reason. Literally that.
I think we've come to the end. I think we've discussed everything. If anyone, we still have some time. If anyone has any burning questions to ask, you just raise your hand or put it in the chat, and then I can read it out. Otherwise, I'll hand it over to Razi to give us a little outro.
Right. Well, I don't see any hands. So I want to thank Eamon and James. And from now on, we are back every Wednesday. And next Wednesday, we are discussing Ayn Rand's essay, Philosophy and Sense of Life, at the same time. Wednesday at 7 p.m. UK time. That's 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. And tomorrow, the Daily Objective, Jonathan Honig, Mark Pellegrino, and Rucka. And on Friday, on the Daily Objective, it's Jonathan Honig and Nikos with, again, James Valliant as a guest, discussing the Atlas Shrugged movies. So that will be a very interesting episode. So until next time, see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.